Welcome to the 15th World Congress of Social Economics, and welcome. And welcome to Brock University. I'm Bob Dimand. I'm here at Brock University. For those of you who might not know it, in particular, anyone who went to school in the United States will not have heard about this. Brock University is named for General Sir Isaac Brock, the general who defeated the American invasion of Canada in the War of 1812, and who is responsible for the fact that we are not currently in the United States. So now I'd like to introduce the president of the Association for Social Economics, Ellen Mutare, who has a few announcements to make concerning the conference.
Thank you all for coming. We have what looks to be, and yes, you can hardly see me. I know, I'll stand on my tiptoes. We have what looks to be a fabulous conference coming up, and I thank you all for your participation in making it an amazing couple of days. We've already had a wonderful day and a half because we had a summer school pre-conference for graduate students and junior faculty to learn more about our association and learn more about social economics, and that's been absolutely amazing. John Davis and Jonathan White did a lot of work on that, and we want to thank them one more time. Brock have been amazing hosts, and we'll thank Bob more tomorrow night at the dinner, but let's thank him now, too. So just a couple of updates. We've had visa issues. The Americans have been being horrible to some people and had some visa problems. We've had weather crises on the East Coast. So in terms of the papers presented as opposed to the summer school, unfortunately, also because of a number of issues, John Henry is not going to be with us. He was going to be on our plenary tomorrow in honor of Fred Lee, the late Fred Lee, and also had another paper, so I'm very sorry to say that he's not going to be here. And also, Yulia Yurchenko from the University of Greenwich was going to be on Wednesday morning, and she was unable to come, so just make updates on your program so that you know that. And so I'm sure we'll see a lot of each other over the next few days, and I look forward to it. I'm going to turn this back to Bob to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Well, it's a tremendous pleasure and honor to introduce our opening plenary speaker, Kari Polanyi Levitt, founder of the Karl Polanyi Institute of Political Economy at Concordia University, professor emeritus of economics at McGill University, officer of the Order of Canada. And here, rather than list the awards and distinctions that she's received, I should mention that she's been sufficiently eminent in fields like development studies that it's not that she gets awards, but that awards are named for her. So that in the Canadian Journal of Development Studies, if you publish a really good article, you have a chance of winning the Kari Polanyi Levitt Award. So it's another level of distinction when instead of winning awards, the awards are being named for you. One of Kari's most recent book, which will be of great interest to people here, From the Great Transformation to the Great Financialization on Karl Polanyi and Other Essays, published in 2013 by Fernwood and Zed Books. She's, as founder of the Karl Polanyi Institute of Political Economy, named for her father, of course, has edited and contributed to such important work as The Life and Work of Karl Polanyi and Karl Polanyi in Vienna, conference volumes from the Karl Polanyi Institute of Political Economy. She's probably particularly known in Canada for her book Silent Surrender, the Multinational Corporation in Canada, published in 1970, but also has published on such subjects as Canada-West Indies economic relations. It's a tremendous pleasure to have Kari here. it's a wonderful thing for the conference, and we look forward to hearing from Kari about Karl Polanyi and about the great financialization. And I ask Kari to come up to the podium and take the floor.
Thank you, Bob, for that lovely introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This thing is in my pocket, and I hope it's working.
It's working.
Good. Well, let me start by thanking Bob Dimand for introducing me to this wonderful association of social economics. An association, I confess, I had never heard of. I did not know it existed, and I was really very heartened to discover that your association here was founded in 1941 by two Jesuit priests. I think their names were Mr. Dempster and a Mr. Divine. Yes, correct. And one of them, I think a Mr. Dempster, had the good fortune to study with Joseph Schumpeter, and the other one had the bad fortune to study with Lionel Robbins at the LSE. Lionel Robbins, of course, is the author of that famous textbook called The Nature and Significance of Economic Science, which presents economics as a science in some way analogous to the natural sciences. I may say that I myself studied as an undergraduate at the London School of Economics, and this was the book which with which I was presented as the founding authority on the subject. And I still remember my reactions when I was probably only 18 of dismissing this as really quite irrelevant. I am happy with the existence of an association like this, which is concerned with introducing ethics and society into the discourse of economics. Because, let's face it, we live in society. We do not live in an economy. An economy is part of society. It is, in many ways, a social construct. But we do not, fortunately, live all our lives in economic activity. I mean, we are not really put on this earth to be the supply side of a labor market or the demand side of a market for consumer goods and services. We do some of that. We have no alternative because that is how our society here is structured and how most of us make a living. But that is not the purpose of life or of society. So I'm very happy to be in these surroundings, and I really wish all the very best of a future for this association. We are in severe need of this kind of a meeting ground where we can actually talk about things that are really important and that really matter, and that unfortunately we cannot do in the sort of intellectual silos into which the social sciences are divided, one of which is economics, which in addition to being a silo is also, unfortunately, more removed from any recognizable reality than any of these other social sciences, because it has become so mathematical and so econometric. So, in this company, obviously, I am invited to speak about the work of my father, Karl Polanyi, which I will enjoy doing, because Karl Polanyi has extended the conversation to go beyond the economy and to deal ultimately with the relationship of economy to society. He once wrote that the subject of my research is the place of the economy in society. So with Karl Polanyi, we go beyond the usual debate, which is the market, the relationship of the market and state, stimulus or austerity, to speak about the relationship of the market with the whole of society. And the whole of society, of course, includes its political governance, otherwise known as the state. And so with Polanyi, we move into an area that is, I think, close to the mission of this association that deals with the relationship between the market and the larger society. Now, interestingly, there is now a 6-part documentary film, an excellent production, on the theme of capitalism. And it presents all the major economists from Smith, Malthus, Ricardo, Karl Marx, Keynes, Hayek, and Friedman. And this last of the 6 one-hour segments present Karl Polanyi. And they present Karl Polanyi as taking us beyond the discussion of market versus state and taking us into the larger issues of the ultimate viability of a society whose economic institutions are structured to respond to the signals of individual gain. The idea that a modern complex society should be organized on the principle of individual gain in the market is, according to Polanyi, historically bizarre, unique, and totally unprecedented. And a society in which people and families can fall into poverty and misery in circumstances where the rest of society is doing quite well is also unique to our modern capitalist society. So I would like to look at the crisis, because I believe it is a crisis with which we are currently faced, to lay it out and then to ask a question of what would be Karl Polanyi's analysis or take or opinion about the possibilities of exiting from this crisis. The crisis in this book, which Bob kindly mentioned, advertisement, from the Great Transformation to the Great Financialization. It is called Essays on Karl Polanyi and on Karl Polanyi and Other Essays. There are 8 essays that have basically been draw on lectures I have given about the work of my father. But the rest of the book is about my own work, which, as many of you know, really has to do with the development of the non-European world, or otherwise the global south. The crisis I have written in this book, I profoundly believe, is more intractable than that of the 1930s. It is not as dramatic. The 1930s industrial production in the United States declined by 50%. It was a total disaster. The fallout from the financial crisis of 2008 did not produce unemployment on that kind of scale. But I suggest that the crisis is more intractable and more difficult to resolve because governments have become captive to financial markets and to corporate power. And not only in the United States, where that is really very obvious, where there are no restrictions on the amount of money that private individuals and corporations can spend in buying political influence. That is quite extraordinary. Certainly such a thing does not obtain in any other country I know of. But also in Europe, you have, I'm afraid, a dysfunctional political system. And many of us right now have our minds on the negotiations of Greece with its creditors. But you have a system in Europe whereby negotiations going on and cannot resolve the issues between the creditor countries and the debtor countries, or more exactly, the interests of the creditor banks and the populations of those countries which are indebted. Now, I see five aspects of the crisis. The first is that it is now evident that the prospect will be for stagnation or very low rates of growth, perhaps even no growth, in the heartlands of capitalism. North America, Europe, also Japan, but in some ways that is of less significance, I think. And I may say that I don't think that we had need of Larry Summers to tell us that. Because it was splashed all around the place that the famous Larry Summers had declared that stagnation wasn't the new norm. But I think many of us had seen that long before. The second, of course, and the major cause of concern is the very, very high level of inequality, of income, and of wealth. And of course, the Piketty book, 21st Century Capital, I think it's called, I think made a very important contribution by bringing this to the attention of the world. I believe myself that there are in many quarters of the oligarchic elites, there is concern that the degree of inequality and the obvious injustice of it presents a danger to social stability. And some of their speculations, go as far as fear of revolutions, fear of upheaval, fear of circumstances which will not be good for their interests either. Thirdly, we have a rampant financialization which really has not been addressed. The profits of banks and other financial institutions are running as high as ever. The total amount, I believe, of their various assets and derivatives of their assets have increased over what they were before 2009. I may be mistaken, but I don't think so. The fact is that in spite of a lot of talk, nothing has been done to fix that problem, and it threatens to produce, obviously, another financial bubble. And whereas there were resources and they could draw on the group of 20 the last time to pool a lot of resources to save the banks, this is by no means clear that they could do that. a next time. But now we come to two aspects of the crisis which I think have not been given sufficient attention. And the first has to do with the changing nature of labor markets. Not only the fact that globalization has obviously depressed wages in the more advanced countries, but that it has, that the competition and the search for ever more profitable places in which to invest huge sums of money, which are sitting there waiting to find somewhere where they can get a profitable return, has speeded up, I believe, the rate of technological change. We hear all the time the magic word is innovation. It would appear somehow innovation is the way to salvage the system but the rate at which labor is now being displaced by automation and robotization is much greater than we might have thought even a few years ago. And we were in conversation, somebody was telling me about the reduction of workers in Stelco in Hamilton. Can't remember the figures, but they were from, I don't know, some close to 20,000 down to a few hundred. And the examples of this kind of displacement of workers by automation are legion. And so what this promises is a future where many people will be forced to scramble for some kind of living in a labor market increasingly precarious, at wages which in jobs which are below their actual qualifications and education. And it looks like a huge looming social problem which has not been addressed, along with the financial problem, not been addressed. And finally, we have, of course, the environmental problem, and that could be a whole lecture. But what is clear is that as the problem has not been addressed by the major industrialized countries. And so there is a speculation out there, and I think I'm referring to a very thoughtful and interesting article by Wolfgang Streeck in the New Left Review. I think many of you know the article, I cannot remember its name, but something to the effect, isn't capitalism nearing its end? And in this article, he suggests that it is almost impossible to imagine that our societies, thinking of Europe, think of Europe and North America, including Canada, United States, have got the resilience, are able to mobilize the kind of collective will of the magnitude for the changes which would be required to really address the ecological problem, the necessity to reduce very rapidly the use of hydrocarbons, etc. Because, he suggests, our societies have been fractured, individualized, partially damaged by the pervasive thrust of the market into the tissue of society. And I would say that when we talk about financialization, it's not only the accumulation and the misdoings of the big financial companies, but it reaches right down into the heart of middle-class life, in terms of student loans, in terms of mortgage debt, and when the price of houses go down, people are stuck without the equity, but with the debt. And that runs right across the whole middle class of the societies of the West. So that brings me to Polanyi. That brings me to Polanyi in the sense he has been described as the theorist of the social in economics. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the life of my father. Let's put it this way. I like to start this by posing a question, because, of course, the most important book is The Great Transformation. And the question is this: how is it that a book written by somebody virtually unknown 70 years ago, who never had formal certification in any social science, who never founded a journal or a school, has not only survived for 70 years, but has been rediscovered in recent times and rightly considered as one of the classics of the 20th century. More than that, by some people considered to be the economist of the 21st century. Now, tell me something. Did I already tell you about the 6-part documentary on capitalism? Yes. I did? Yes. Thanks. Because it is important, because this filmmaker, who is a professional documentarist, he is not a political economist, came to the subject. He got a contract from the German-French Arte Network, and somehow he discovered for himself the work of Karl Polanyi. Then he came knocking on my door about 4 years ago and interviewed me on the subject, and he became so enthusiastic that he built the whole of the last part of the film around the ideas of Karl Polanyi, including the anthropological work he did. Now, question: what is it about the book? Well, I think part of it has to do with its language and its method of communication. I mean, it is written in a way, you talk about the dark satanic mills of William Blake. It is poetic, it is sometimes over the top, it is dramatic. It is, frankly speaking, a kind of a work that I could not possibly imagine would ever have got published if it had been written by somebody in a university. I don't think so. Let me just, a little aside. This is from my personal experience. This doesn't belong in this talk, but somehow I felt like sharing this with you. I started at McGill as a very junior lecturer and eventually became just a lecturer and then an assistant professor, and 10 years down the road, by 1970, I came up for tenure, for promotion to associate professor. And at that time, I was engaged in a huge study on the inter-industry structure of the Atlantic provinces of Canada, with input-output tables, projects up in Statistics Canada, employing quite a few people. And there was a committee. I may say that the most prominent two members of the Department of Economics, Professors Weldon and Asimakopoulos, Mario Sekerecha is here. You can talk to him about how wonderful were those two teachers, but they were not on the committee. There were 4 other people. And eventually they said, well, yes, when you finish that statistical labor that took 10 years, you get your promotion, that's fine, and your tenure. Now, I had just published Silent Surrender, the multinational corporation in Canada. It had been reviewed by the New York Times on the front page of the business section, with a picture, an interview, A lot of buzz around the department. So the four gentlemen who were the full professors, they said, well, you know, Kari, we have a question for you. What do you really think about this book that you have written? And I said, well, I think in the circumstances, it is for you to judge my work. You know, I'm coming up there to be judged. They said, well, yes, but we'd like to know what you think about it. I was not expecting that question, and I paused for a while, and I said, I think it is the most important thing that I have done, and probably, perhaps the most important thing I will ever do in the rest of my professional life. Well, you know, you should see the jaws drop and they could not understand. But the reason I'm telling you is this book was written because I got engaged in a discussion about foreign ownership. I was not paid for this. I did this on my own time. All the drafts of it were done because I was engaged with the issue I had. I felt strongly about it. It actually started as policy papers for the newly established NDP. The point I'm making is that the statistical study I was engaged in cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't know how many people ever read the final huge two reports, other than graduate students, to see what other people had done. The book Silent Surrender, for which was not funded by anybody, which was not paid by anybody, which I wrote on my own time, and which I still think is probably the most important contribution I ever made to Canadian political economy. And I say this in connection with the academy and its particular ways of operating. So when people ask the question, did Karl Polanyi perhaps make a mistake? He chose a bad career path. If he had gone to the university, the academy route, like his friends Mannheim or George Lukács, his ideas might have been known sooner. I say no, I don't think so, because it was the lived experience of my father that gave rise to the vision and the insight of that book. And I do believe, even on my own experience, a little story I told you about Silent Surrender, that if he had gone the university route, he would have been distracted by all kind of debates of the kind about how many, angels can sit on the head of the pin, that are part of academic life, inevitably. And this book would not have been written. So two things I hope I have enough time to tell you. I want to tell you a little bit about the lived experience of Karl Polanyi, which I believe accounts really for the, what can I say, for that book. My father, there was family influence. The family influence, his mother was a Jewish Russian from Vilnius, then in Russia. His father was a Jewish Hungarian. The family started in Vienna. They were Russophile. There was a family friendship with a gentleman who was the representative of all Russian social democratic parties in Vienna in the 1880s and 1890s, a long time ago. And there, my father told me that he had remembered these Russian revolutionaries coming to Vienna, some of them with their with no shoes and their feet tied in newspapers, and they were looked after and cared for by our family friends and by his mother in our home, it made a very big impression. He had a huge respect for the individual courage of revolutionaries. And when he met my mother, I cannot tell you of her career, but she had her own place in Hungarian history as a revolutionary, opposed to the First World War. He said, well, her name was Polish, it sounded Russian, and that was good enough for him. And he was in love with this beautiful young woman. And that is a relationship that lasted for the 40 years of their marriage, described as the fidelity of equals, because my father was a thinker, a writer, often lonely task of the intellectual. My mother was a political activist, but they shared a similar outlook on life. Now, then my father was the founder of the Hungarian student movement before the First World War, a fabulous orator, according to all accounts. I think 1913, that war that broke out in 1914 was totally unexpected. Many of you have read the literature, but only the day before yesterday, a cousin of mine from New York, who is looking through family papers, she called me and she said, look, I want you to read this letter to you. And it is in French, and it is from a Swiss lady who was engaged by my family in Budapest to teach eurythmics. And she, I think, had a very special relationship with my uncle, Michael Polanyi, and she relates how they walked along the Danube on one evening in 1914 when the declaration of the story about the First World War broke out. And before that, she had described the dinner table where this family was having an animated discussion about the merits of some theory of the philosopher Kant in German and Hungarian and whatever. In other words, that First World War that happened apparently came out of nowhere, or appeared to do so, and the affair was settled. It was believed that whatever affair having to do with the assassination of the Archduke by a Serb would be settled, and it turned into 4 years of a ghastly war. My father was engaged in that war on the Russian front. I think it was the defining moment of his life, and that was the time from which he felt a responsibility of himself and his whole generation for the collapse of the civilization of the 19th century, of the Belle Epoque, and all of that. It's on the first page of the book. He then emigrated to Vienna. In Vienna, he engaged a fellow by the name of Mises. Now, this Ludwig von Mises, amazingly, his name still lives. There are clubs of Mises. There is a society based in Toronto. It represents the most extreme libertarian views, most extreme opposition to any form of government in the economy. But my father debated him on the issue of the feasibility of a socialist economy. And interestingly, Polanyi's idea of possibly such an economy was based on the principle, yes, there would be prices that would assure efficiency, but they would be moderated by the principle of distributional equity, and the whole thing would take place in an environment of participatory democracy, basically by negotiation of producers, consumers, and municipalities, and so forth. Then I don't have time, unfortunately, to tell you the whole story, but after that, with the rise of fascism, my father left for England. In England, he had a support system among Christian socialists. They called themselves the New Left. They were people he had met in Vienna, English family. When I was later sent to England, I went to live with them. I mention that because the Christian Left, he was a co-editor of book called Christianity and the Social Revolution. Contributions there were by the famous Joseph P. Needham. Some of you may have heard of him, I think, as his magnificent work in chronicling the entire history of technology in China. Then in 1937, he obtained employment with the Workers' Educational Association, lecturing in small towns in Kent and Sussex in England. So as an adult educator, I may say in Vienna he was a journalist. So he was a journalist. He was an adult educator. He had a relationship with Christian socialists. In 1940, he found himself in the United States, and for various reasons was offered a 2-year fellowship where he wrote The Great Transformation, where my mother joined him to help him. They returned in 1943 at the height of the war, after the Battle of Stalingrad had turned the tide of war toward Allied victory. I must tell you that I myself was in London throughout the whole war. We followed these events, and as far as I'm concerned, the defeat of Hitler's many divisions was the achievement of the Red Army. And we don't hear about that. You might think that the British and the Americans and whatever won the Second World War in Europe. It's simply not true. War in Pacific is another issue. That was American victory. In any event, he returned in 1943 and wrote some very important articles. I think an interesting article was, he was profoundly wrong, okay? But here's the title of the article. It was called Universal Capitalism or Regional Economic Planning, published in 1945 in a well-known journal in London, in which he said that it seemed only the United States anymore believes in universal capitalism. Otherwise, in the rest of the world, it's history because of the Great Depression and the collapse of the system in the 1930s. Well, he was wrong, because it took another 50 years before we could realize that there really is a major problem with universal capitalism, otherwise known as globalization. But I'm mentioning this story because I believe it was the lived experience in Budapest, in Vienna, in London, in New York. My mother made a home in Canada because she was denied entry to the United States for having former Communist Party membership. She made a home for my father so he could visit from New York frequently. And when he retired, he came to live there because he could not live without her. And if she had not made that home near Toronto, he was ready to leave his position at Columbia and just go back to England with my mother. She, I think, made a considerable sacrifice, to go into some obscure little place and just establish some kind of home there outside of Toronto so my father could visit. So he lived a world life. There was never, what is so interesting about Polanyi's work, among other things, I think, is there is not an alternative model. There is not one alternative to capitalism, to the globalized, universalized capitalism. But yet, in that central thesis of the Great Transformation about the fictitious commodities of labor, land, and money, that was, in a sense, the turning point. That was the birth of something new. He called it the machine age, the Industrial Revolution, that reduced what used to be independent artisans and farmers into wage employees, so-called free labor. When they say free labor, that sounds very good, but they were also free of any obligation by landowners or people in the villages or anywhere to have any responsibility for this labor. So, whereas before. Now I have to stop. I'm not stopping my talk there. Please let me continue, because there is a second part to it. And the second part that I wanted to talk about was the concept in Polanyi's work of the double movement. Because this is one of the most intriguing and interesting aspects of his set of concepts. So he has the fictitious commodities, labor, land, and money, and he talks about the double movement. And here's a story. It's on the first page of the book. So he says that a system that is totally uncontrolled, where will be completely scramble of free markets for labor, land, and money, is not viable. It would result in the devastation of society and the devastation of nature. So there are always some countervailing measures of regulation or whatever that operate in order to make it actually functioning. So he suggests that the Industrial Revolution and the theories, the political economy of the classics, that is Malthus and Ricardo, not Smith. Smith, another story, but Malthus and Ricardo were more revolutionary than the technological innovations in the spinning industry, which were largely mechanical improvements of various kinds. He considered that this idea of the making of markets for labor by removing all provision for the poor, which had been there since Elizabethan times, criminalizing poverty and forcing people onto the labor market, even if they were working 12 or 14 hours a day, mostly women and children, as it happened, was a revolutionary idea. I mean, a radical idea. And that it promised both enormous increase in productivity and enormous destruction of societal relations, and ultimately also of the natural environment. If you move, I would like to suggest that we look at the comparison between theories of Marx and Polanyi, taking into account the fact of the era and the time. Marx had discovered industrial capitalism in England, more or less in the 1840s, and that was an industrial capitalism of the sheer exploitation of labor. Labor was, without any question, the principal source of value, at that time. And the class conflict, according to Marx, then was between capital and labor, whereas in Ricardo's days it had been in many ways between landlords and capitalist farmers or industrial farmers. Let's leave that aside for a moment. Now, as the century progressed, productivity increased. Wages actually also rose. But from the 1870s, 73 to 1896, something it's called the Long Depression, of diminishing profits and diminishing prices, and largely due to the revolution in communication and shipping that brought a lot of wheat and meat and other basic foods from North America and Australia to Europe, and created a big crisis there in agriculture, also in industry. So the counter movement then to the opening of these world markets was by Bismarck, the maker of modern Germany since 1870, not only to protect the farmers, the Prussian farmers and the industrialists of the Ruhr, but also to introduce social security. And in Germany and in Austria and Switzerland and Scandinavia, social security measures were introduced in the 19th century, in the 1870s and 80s, at a time when those countries were 10 times poorer than they are today. Coming to tell me 5 minutes. Yeah. I would like I think that this is important. And why were they introduced? It was in order to stabilize society, in order to take the edge off the formation of mass socialist parties, Germany and Austria, mass socialist parties that were founded in the 1880s. And toward the 1890s, I mean, you are now getting a huge social class conflict there in continental Europe. And that is where the Pope issued his famous decree, Rerum Novarum, 1891, which was the beginning of the social doctrine of the Church, Catholic Church, and which I think was the principle that motivated the founders of your association, the two Jesuit economists in 1941, because that was a doctrine which acknowledged not only the rights of property, that was to be expected, but the rights of labor to organize. So it was a doctrine which conceded the rights of labor as well as the rights of property. It formed the basis of the social doctrine of the Church, if you wish, a conservative, not reactionary, but conservative basis that would be the philosophy even today of the Christian democratic parties of countries like Germany. But now, fast forward this, if you take this story forward, you will come to the 30s and the Depression. And in the 30s, the counter movement came, the New Deal in the United States, the Soviet five-year planning, which started in 1929 in the Soviet Union, various forms of fascism in continental Europe. And interestingly, although Keynes turned out to be really the economist who dominated the 30 good years from 45 to 75, in England, at that time, the establishment did not take on Keynes. They respected him, they may have listened to him, but did not accept any of his advice. And some of you know, I was at the London School of Economics during the war in England, and Keynes was not on the curriculum. And the changes, the social welfare system that was designed by Lord Beveridge during the Second World War, did not come into effect until after the war. Only the sacrifices of that war, the sacrifices of the English public and all of us who were there at that time, who said, after this is done, there will be no more unemployment. Understand? No more unemployment will be tolerated. And then came the change. But the change had come earlier in America, come earlier in Europe, but England, very conservative country. I'm going to have to stop there, because what I want, the thought I wish to leave you with, is what today, after we have globalization, after we have a labor market that really has profoundly diminished the powers of labor, where is this second movement, this double movement? Where is this resistance coming from? That is a very bad place to stop a lecture, because it's the most interesting question, but maybe we can have some questions. We can pursue it. There are people who believe that it is in the social economy, a social and solidarity economy, but it is certainly in many other aspects. But what is so interesting, I believe, is that we are here talking about the good, a healthy and functioning and viable society. Let us not be carried away by discussing always the economy, but you have to look at the society, because we live in society, and it's ultimately the society that is going to determine whether a country can overcome these problems or not. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have time for the question and answer period. So if you have a question or comment, please put up your hand and bring the microphone to you.
Yes, my name is John Smithin from York University. You very eloquently described what motivated your father and why he took the path that he did and where his books came from.
Yeah, speak up, please.
Hold it up to your mouth. Okay, can you hear now? Yes. Yeah, okay. So I wanted to say you very, very eloquently described what motivated your father and why he took the course that he did, and, you know, why his interests were his interests. I wonder if you would care to do the same with your own career. You know, what motivated you and why did you choose the path that you did?
Sorry, I can't hear. You have to speak louder.
Kari, you
I
spoke
couldn't hear.
about what motivated
Yes.
your father's
Yes.
path in life.
Yes.
Could you speak a bit about what motivated your path in life and what led you
Yes.
to work on the things that you worked on?
Oh, thank you so much for that question. I'd love to talk about that. You know, I think there are defining moments in people's lives. I said that I think defining moment in my father's life was his experience in the First World War. I know the defining moment in my life came when I was 10 years old. And it happened in Vienna. There was a civil war lasting 5 days in February 1934, when there was, so to speak, a final showdown between the working class movement and the regime of Austro-fascist regime, in which they brought out the big guns, quite literally. Where I was living, I could see them coming down the street with the big guns, and they bombarded the tenement houses, the social housing, where the workers were defending themselves. And I knew that this was about to happen. And so I knew that there was to be a general strike, and I knew which side I was on. I knew which side my family was on. My father was already in England, but my mother was active in this movement. So when I was going to school, I may say I was 10 years old, I would take 2 trams to go to school. And I do wonder how it is, why in Canada and the United States children are driven to school when they're 10 years old. Because I was able to find my way onto 2 streetcars and go to my school. So halfway, I saw that the big clock in a major square, called the Praterstern in Vienna, had stopped. And I knew that the strike had started because obviously the electricity workers were down and all the electrical things had stopped. And I turned back and went back home. And my mother said, look, I'm busy now, and you are in charge of the household. You're in charge of the house, of your grandmother. They gave me a paper note. I'd never had a paper note in my hand in my life. 10-shilling note, and I went downstairs and stocked up on bread and potatoes and stuff, and told my grandmother that we must fill everything with water in case they lock off the water. It was a pretty good idea for a 10-year-old at that time. And I was very proud of myself. And of course, eventually when the lights came back on the Thursday of that week, my grandmother was very pleased. But I knew that that was very bad, because it meant that, our side was losing. And when I went back to school, it was a good school, a public school. Almost half our teachers were gone. They had all been arrested. The head of the school was not there. We were assembled brought down to a big assembly and made to learn the national anthem, which we didn't know before. And we had to join some kind of a movement and have little pins with the national flags on it. And I remember that my girlfriend and I, her name was Gertie Vesely, I remember her name to this day, and we were 10 years old, and we were asked to be excused. And we went in the cloakroom, and we picked all the pins of all the coats, and they went down the toilet, flushed them down the toilet. We came and sat down, looking very like little angels. So you see, for me, that was the defining moment of my life. I knew which side I was on. When we came to England, I used to save my shilling a week that I got for allowance and send them back to the, I can't remember, the Socialist Red Cross or something to Vienna. And then it was in school, we wanted to form a socialist society. We were told that we couldn't do that. We formed a political society. We made sweaters. We knitted sweaters to go to the international brigades in Spain as schoolgirls in England. I organized it. You could knit a front or a back or a right sleeve or a left sleeve. and at the end of the day, 2 of us had to sew it together. And of course, some of them were very tightly knit and some were very loose, and you had to wash everything. We dispatched 2.5 sweaters. The half was the one that had no sleeves. So you're asking me, where did it all start? So when I wanted actually to study physics. I wanted to do atomic physics. And I also loved history. These were my 2 favorite subjects. And I wrote an exam in history to Oxford, and I got accepted, but I didn't get a scholarship, so couldn't go. So next time I tried the one for the physics, 5 papers, 6 papers in mathematics. I had to prepare myself alone because the school said they didn't have the competence to help me with that at that level. My parents were in America. My father was writing the book. My mother had joined him. And I did quite well with the papers. And I got into the second year of physics, but no scholarship. So no scholarship, we had no money, so no physics. I said, I am an academic failure. And I will go to the London School of Economics because I will learn how to make the world a better place, how to abolish unemployment and poverty. And I must tell you that in my generation at that time, that was the motive that people went to study economics. So I keep asking instructors here, everywhere, about young people today, why do they study economics?
Same reason. Same reason.
Same reason? Same reason. Really? Same reason? Well, I'm delighted to hear that because I'm hearing that it's because they think they can get in the business of finance or something like that. But I'm happy to hear that some are studying for the same reason. But so I thought I would do labor economics. And when I finally came to Canada, I did work. I worked in a factory for a while, but I worked in a mine mill and smelter workers union office. I put out a journal. But eventually I decided that what I really wanted to do was to go back to university. And there I discovered a new subject, the new subject of the economics of underdevelopment. And it caught my interest, and that was in the 1950s. And that has been my subject that catches my interest ever since. And at that time, and I wanted to use my mathematical abilities and training and statistics, and did 10 years of making input-output calculations and models for the Atlantic provinces of Canada in Ottawa. I look back on it as a huge waste of energy and time. But it did not, because it was never used for anything. It was technically innovative, but otherwise an enormous waste of time. So and I think, to come back to the little story about silent surrender, which was a request by Charles Taylor. Canadians here at least would know who was Charles Taylor. He was my colleague at the time. We had a joint department, economics, political science. And he came to me about 65 and said, Kari, would you write a position paper for the NDP on foreign ownership? I said, sure. For the New Democratic Party, thank you. For the New Democratic Party on foreign ownership. I said, sure, and it started as a paper, and it got more and more elaborate until it became a book. And I still think that was a much better contribution than all the 10 years I spent with Statistics Canada. That was funded to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was never used. I don't know if that answers some of the questions.
Mary. Kari, it's Marion.
Oh, hi.
Okay.
Yeah.
I should mention first and foremost that every time I listen to you, you never cease to teach me more. New ideas, new thinking. I could, honestly, ever since I took the course with you, the first course that I ever took, in fact, is related to silent surrender. Mm-hmm. It's related also to the economics of quote-unquote underdevelopment. Mm-hmm. And it was a course that you gave at the time. The first course I ever took with you was in the winter of 1972.
Oh, yeah?
And since then, as I said, I think I've learned a hell of a lot. Every time I hear you, I learn a lot more. I do, however, want to question one thing that you said. Okay? And
coming with basic income?
Not at all, not at all. That one I think we probably agree on.
Okay. Okay.
Even though we may have some nuance there
okay.
But there's something else what you said, which is that you said, if there will be, and there may well be, because we haven't really revamped, we haven't re-regulated the financial sector in particular, that the probability of having another financial crisis and breakdown of the system is, if it were to happen again, we would not, governments do not have the resources, you said, at least that's what I understood, to be able to deal with it. And especially in dealing with the banks, again. And there, I think I would like to differ on that point, which is that, yes, it's true that they do not, well, actually, I would kind of quote maybe Keynes or someone else to say that there can never be any lack of money, if you wish, or finance. There never is, in fact. Okay? And if there were a war tomorrow morning, we will not have the problem of finance. What we have as lacking is the political will, and indeed also the imagination in order to deal with it, which is lacking. We have fallen back into these old theories about how we should deal with economic policy matters. And we have set up an institutional structure in place, and the worst case is the case of the Eurozone, which prevents governments from doing anything, basically, and puts them in a kind of lobster trap situation. Now, that is the problem. It's not the lack of resources. In fact, even in the US, what they should have done, frankly, was to let those banks go down enough, buy them up, and turn them into public utilities, basically. That would have solved a lot of problems. And it would not have been anything to do with lack of funds or lack of money, because they wasted so much. So, as I said, on that issue, I think I would perhaps question your point on that. Now, I'm not sure if maybe you would agree, perhaps. I'd like to think you would.
Well, maybe I'd reformulate it. And it's not lack of money they have. It's a lack of political capital that they have expended. I mean, I don't think it's going to be politically possible for them to go to save these banks again and spend public funds, what people perceive to be public funds, even if the money is only printed. I don't think. And then you have the G20. The last time they called the G20, this looked as though it was going to be some kind of more or less stable backup to the G7. And then it kind of faded away. So I don't know. First, I do believe that there is an asset bubble that is forming, right? And secondly, we don't know what will happen, but somehow I think that they are more likely to let a lot of the banks go down rather than infuriating the public by using what the public appear to see as public funds to save the banks again. I don't know. I don't know.
One more question.
I have a question concerning your uncle. If I indeed understand who your uncle was, is he the Michael Polanyi of tacit dimension?
Yes, he is.
Yes. Well, he went in a very different direction from your father. In fact, he became somewhat of a Hayekian and a London School of Economics Robinsonian. And was there great tension between your father and his brother concerning essentially their outlook on what an economy is?
Well, I must tell you that it was a remarkable tribute to the strength of the family bonds, right? That they had a tremendous difference of opinion without any personal falling out, right? It was really a wonderful thing to witness. My father was the older one, always considered Michael as the younger brother whom he had to take care of. The differences were huge. The differences were in the 30s about the Soviet Union, because my father considered that the only way that fascism and the Germans could be resisted would be by an alliance with the Soviet Union to beat them. And my uncle Michael thought that the Soviet Union was simply the worst, everything, the most evil of everything. But the personal relations always remained amicable. And I right to the end. So that's the answer. There is a biography of my father coming out very soon. It's published by Columbia University Press. It is written by Gareth Dale, who wrote a very good intellectual biography that is published, I think, Polity Press. But this is now going to be a personal biography. And he has researched a lot of correspondence between Karl and Michael, and a lot of that is contained in the book. A lot of it was news to me, but they exchanged letters all the time. And incidentally, when you read these biographies of people even older than I, and I'm pretty old, you realize how much we are losing from moving for written letters to emails. Yes. I mean, the whole of this correspondence of people that used to be, whether it's handwriting or typing, it's all gone. It's gone. But that's my answer. Any other questions?
Thank you so very much, Kari. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you for that.
See you all.